Hello everybody, welcome to Distance Learning 101. In this topic, we'll talk about some thoughts on live classes. Now, I have to confess, this was a video I didn't think I was going to be a topic, but in the course of kind of interacting and communicating with teachers and some organizations over the past couple days, it's clear that some groups of teachers are thinking of going in this direction. And while I don't want to say, no, don't do live classes, because there are people who, in their organizations and groups and places where you can definitely succeed at this. I did want to share some of the thoughts that we've had on experimenting with it over the past decade and a half and doing distance learning and the things that we've learned. The first thing is that it is by far the most difficult thing to do well in terms of distance learning. And there's a bunch of reasons why. First of all, the logistics of trying to get all your students together at one place and one time. And a caveat to this too is that the more students you have, the exponentially more difficult it gets. So getting all the students together at one place and one time can be really hard. Kids are going to sleep in. Kids are going to forget. The technology might work. The technology might not work. So there's a lot of different things that are going to happen in terms of the logistics of bringing everybody together at one time. Some kids just aren't going to be able to attend at a given point in time because of something that happens in the environment that they're in. The second thing is that you're adding a level of technology complexity beyond even just connecting online, because if you want to see your students, well, do you want them to have video cameras? That's another level of technology. Do you want them they have to have audio that's working. If you want to hear them, they have to have a mic that's working. So while most of these things in a lot of environments are surmountable and workable, for a lot of kids, they can be really challenging. And especially if the kids aren't 100% invested in making it work, then you run into a whole nother layer of issues there. So the technology can be really challenging. The third is it's really hard to be engaging in a session like that. The content that you're trying to bring, it's just tricky to do that. It's tough to read the students too as well. If you're explaining something or if there's a work session, now it's times to kind of seem like dead times and kids are like, well, why am I watching this? We're just doing stuff. I don't see the teacher's not talking. So all that kind of stuff that works really well in a live classroom environment tends to really struggle because of the tools and the mechanics and the lack of skill sometimes with the students that are in there in terms of handling it, asking questions, and there's just a lot of dead time, and it just hard to manage in terms of making that time spent together super engaging. The next thing, the other part that can happen too, is that kids are going to miss it. A lot of kids are going to miss it. It very likely could sit there at the end with like half of your class not having been to this live session. So now you're faced with a couple of things you want to think beforehand. How am I going to be able to record this session so I can make it available to students, which is another level. And if you do record a session that's live with students, one of the things that becomes, if you've watched a live session, if you think live sessions that are happening like that can tend to be boring, a session that's recorded like that is even more so, because viewers have so little tolerance for dead time in a recorded session. We're used to stuff coming at us fast, so they just won't tolerate that and they'll disengage. So for all of those reasons, live sessions can be very, very challenging. Now the question then becomes, well, okay, if we're not doing a live session, how might we still connect with students in this way? Well, if you're thinking about connecting with students synchronously, one of the things that you might consider that would suggest trying is office hours. For example, saying I'm going to be available for students to check in with me between these hours on these days, bring a question, try to stop by once, make it a requirement to stop by once during the week and bring a question and chat. Then you're going to have smaller groups coming in and out. It's going to be a less pressure on you to be on and teaching for all that chunk of time. And you'll be able to kind of test the technology and maybe eventually graduate up to doing some sort of live sessions for students. The other part about this is to consider some asynchronous short video. And I'll probably make a separate session on this, but this is kind of like a 4-minute video, a 5-minute video, a 10-minute video explaining something to your students. Especially if you combine this with the idea of find, don't make, you can often find that the explanations you are going to give are available someplace else online that you can pull in and use instead. Now, the part about this that all teachers who have done this mention is that you can usually distill a 50-minute classroom experience. The instructional portion of it often can be distilled down into about 5 to 15 minutes of video. They're just, in a traditional classroom, there's surprisingly a small amount of time where the teacher is explaining something in kind of this compact fashion. What often happens in a classroom is you explain a little bit, someone has a question, or you see that students aren't understanding it, so you kind of recycle it. Teachers in a live format say the same thing again in a few different ways, but in a digital video format, often that's not as necessary because kids are going to be able to rewind and watch you explain it again. So there's less recycling of explanations in a digital asynchronous video format. So for all those reasons, most of the time when I build a digital lesson, I can take a 50-minute lesson and reduce it to 5 to 15 minutes of actual instructional content. That doesn't mean I'm not building up exercises and things for the students to do around that, but that part where I'm teaching directly to students is actually small, which means that if you're thinking about making asynchronous video or making some videos for your students, it's often less than, you don't want to think about I have to make this 50-minute video. That's too long. You want to think, how can I chop that content up into short 5-minute videos or less that are going to explain these concepts in pieces that students can watch as they are able. So I would encourage that, and I would encourage office hours before I would say jump into live classes. Now, having said that, if you're insistent, if you say, no, we really want to do live classes, I have some thoughts on how you might want to start that. The first is, I would encourage you to start it with small groups. If you're trying to do a group of 20 students together live at the same time, it's going to be really hard. I would say even groups of 2, 3, 4 students, bring them in and say, hey, we're going to try this, and I'd like to get you involved in this piecemeal so that the students get used to it. They feel a little bit more comfortable. And you don't have a lot of opportunity to make it work. This isn't something you're going to be able to try 5 or 6 times before kids check out while you figure it out. So figuring out in small groups is going to give you a little bit more leeway before you bring it to a large group of people. The second thing is to find the right tool, or find a tool that's going to work for you and get used to it. Zoom is awesome for controlling large meetings and stuff like that. Not all schools have access to that. It does require, I believe it requires a download of a client on the other end, or it works best with the download of a client. So that's another technology issue. So it's a little bit, there's some technology issues you have to solve with students as you do that. Hangouts, of course, can work. They're not designed necessarily for teaching so much, so that I'm not sure there's like raise your hand and kind of, it's a little bit trickier to monitor student progress with the Hangout type of situation. We use an open source piece of software called Big Blue Button that we use in our learning management system, and that works really well for the live sessions that we do. So there's a number, and there's other tools out there. This isn't intended as a tool session, but the idea is to find something, test it, make sure it's going to work for you, and it's got the features that you think you need. The last thing I would say is try it with a group of teachers first. Get 3, 4, 5 teachers together and alternate being the instructor and alternate being the student so that you've got some familiarity with the tool as well. If you do those things, I think you've got a better chance of having it succeed when you take it live to a larger group of students. And again, although I don't want to say don't do it, because I know there are going to be teachers that can be totally awesome at this, that are going to make it work, that whose students are going to be ready for it and whose students are going to engage in it, and can be a really fantastic thing. So I'm not going to say don't do it, but I will say that everything we've learned from our experience, it's super challenging, and please think it through before you jump into it. There's a lot of other alternatives to doing a live class with your students, and we found those generally to be more easier to manage and more easy to do and more easy to give engaging learning for your students.